looking at a couple more watercolor techniques today. First technique that we're going to be looking at is using wax with watercolor, and the wax can act as a resist and maybe can add some interesting texture to your piece. So that's the first one we're going to look at. Then we're going to look at how we can use tape in order to mask off areas so the paint or pigment will not go into those areas. Then we'll be looking at salt and seeing what salt does to your watercolor. And so maybe that can be something to add some interesting textures to. And then finally, we're going to be looking at ink and how we can mix ink with our watercolors to maybe make some saturated colors we couldn't have made before, maybe make some other colors pop, and see in the composition and maybe see how these interact with the pigments that already exist in watercolor. We're going to have two sheets. On the first one, we're going to be doing some samples, and then on the second one, we're going to be using all 4 of the techniques that you learn here, all on one page to make a composition in the end. First thing that we're going to be doing is creating squares in order to work in for each of the samples, and then we're going to label each of the squares what each sample will end up being. All right. So now that we've got this all blocked out and labeled, I'm going to start with the first technique. And so what you're going to do is draw something, make some design in here with the crayon. Doesn't really matter what your design is. Alright, now that you've got something drawn in there, you're going to load up a brush, so you're going to get it wet, and then you're just going to pick a color, and I think I'm going to pick some yellow, some orangish yellow, and then you're going to do a wash over it, and then we'll see what happens here. Okay, now you can see that your crayon will act as a resist to whatever color you put on top, so you're going to be able to see the crayon perfectly over the top. And I don't know, hopefully y'all can see this, but you can see that the watercolor is not going into where the crayon is, and you might be able to see it, like, maybe you don't see this, but if you pull it on top, it's just going to pull off, and you can wipe it off, and it's not going to go into the crayon at all. So it's going to exist outside of where the crayon is. And so you can kind of see that with that, maybe you could pull off some interesting things with shading. Maybe you could use it as for your background when you start to do your background. Maybe do a lot of different things with it, but just be creative with whatever you're doing and how you use it. The next thing that we're gonna do is tape. I'm gonna show you how to use tape. So tape is really cool because say we want to keep an area white. So we'll take a piece of this tape and put it across over. Maybe we want to make something here. Let's do this. Maybe you want like something like this going on, and you don't want any color to come into the areas underneath the tape. So what you're gonna do is, again, get some paint, load up your brush, and put a wash down in these areas. Watercolor. So maybe we switch colors. Maybe you get some little bit of blue action. So we get another wash down. Blue up here. Get some more yellow. Some more yellow over here. Alright. Now I'm going to take the tape off. And you will see that there is now a very clear border. None of the paint went in there, and so this is really useful, say if you don't, because watercolor can be hard to work with sometimes, and so sometimes colors will bleed to each other, and if you don't want a color to bleed into the other color, you can use this technique in order to keep that from happening. Right, hopefully you can see. The next technique I'm going to do, you're going to put a wash down beforehand. We got this. So now you're going to take some salt and you're going to sprinkle it on top. And this is a little bit harder to see what happens when it's wet, but you'll see that the color starts pooling into the salt grains, and so it creates this texture, and the salt soaks up the pigment. And so it'll create a cool texture on top, and you can kind of play with it. I mean, you can go in and add some pigment on top of it. So maybe you want to see what happens when you put a lot of saturated blue on top. You see now the water and pigment are attracted to the salt. So you can produce a lot of really cool textures with this technique too. So you can see it's a cool texture. So if you put a lot of salt on, that's what it's gonna look like. Put a little bit of salt on, it'll look different, but we're gonna have to kind of wait for it to dry in order to see the real effects of what's going on here. But I'm gonna try to move some of it around. If you're drawing an animal like a turtle or something, this might look like a turtle shell, or like scales for a lizard, something like that. So one's pretty cool. Then this one, I also like this one a lot. This one's very fun. This last one, the ink. So you're gonna put another wash down. I'm gonna use blue. Oops. So I got a little bit out of the border there. But as y'all remember, I don't know if y'all remember from last time how to lift watercolor out. But we'll try to lift some of this out. All right. So we are going to take this ink, and it comes in a convenient dropper, and we're going to drop some ink onto it. As you can see, it makes this really cool bloom effect. Kind of mixes with the blue, but it's also, as you can see, it's very vibrant. So we will take some of this green and throw this over here. See what happens. But it's gonna do this thing where it spreads out. But that's the gist of what it looks like on top of other watercolor. Well, ink on top of watercolor. So if you want to add some watercolor on top of it, maybe if you add some droplets of water, does some cool things. It's pretty fun to use. Say you have too much on there, you can use a brush like this and just dab it away. You don't like what you've done, and you can take some of it off. This is going to be the closest thing that you can do to erasing it. Alright. And then we'll add some yellow watercolor this time. Maybe a little bit more blue. And we'll take the ink again. A little goes a long way. So you can see that's what kind of happens. All right. Now that we're done with this, we're going to use each of these 4 techniques that you have learned here. I'm going to be very careful with moving that. And we're going to then, on this sheet of paper, after you're done creating all of these, we are going to use those 4 techniques to create a composition that uses balance and emphasis.